Hey everyone, welcome. We're so happy you're here to hear Dr. Buch discuss suicide cases for the attorney. You can go on to the next slide. I'm Dr. Amy Fogelman, and I am honored to be here as the founder and CEO of High Rock Experts. This has been an exciting journey, and I am glad to see a lot of familiar names here. I've dedicated over 2 decades to caring for patients within Harvard-affiliated practices in the Boston area. And then in 2018, I founded High Rock Experts with a core mission to provide ethical, incredible expert reviews. We've matched over 550 medical experts with attorneys across the US. And in 2020, we created High Rock Academy to teach medical professionals how to become credible experts themselves. I'm pleased to introduce another one of our Academy graduates, Dr. Sandip Buch, who will share his insights with you shortly. Next slide. So I'd like to briefly cover today's agenda. After the presentation, we're going to have time for a few questions. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and input them in the question and answer form. The chat is disabled for our talk. And then finally, you want to make sure that you stay until the end of the presentation in order to receive the bonuses that I will be sharing with you. So let's move on to our main event. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Buch. Dr. Buch is a board-certified psychiatrist and has been in practice for 17 years. He is the founder of Psychiatrist, a telepsychiatrist company. He has worked with several high-risk populations, including at Rikers Island, Bellevue Hospital Forensic Psychiatry Floor, and New York's Community Psychiatry Treatment Program, where treatment team visits, where they take care of the severely mentally ill in their shelters or residences doing assessments in the field. He's also a Bears fan, which has caused many of his personal mental health struggles. So let's move on to Dr. Buch.
Thank you, Dr. Fogelman, and thank you everyone for attending. I wanted to do this talk on suicide and self-harm for attorneys. Before we start, I know this is kind of a bummer of a topic, but I wanted to talk about it because it's one of the most common reasons that psychiatrists and psychiatric institutions are taken to court. And I have had a lot of experience with high-risk populations. And so I thought I could add some insight from the doctor's perspective as it relates to legal issues. We'll go over some facts about suicide, define different terms around suicide and risk factors, because this will all feed into malpractice considerations and why people might bring claims against doctors and facilities. And then we'll go into some case studies. Dr. Fogelman went into my background. I wanted to give this talk because I did work at Rikers Island and at Bellevue Hospital Forensic Psychiatric Unit. So this is for anyone at any of the New York City jails, if they have to be admitted for a psychiatric reason, they come to the Bellevue Hospital Forensic Psych Unit. I also worked for New York's assertive community treatment team, which is programs for the severely mentally ill who are outpatients who are in shelters or in their homes. And rather than what we used to, which is rely on them to come to a clinic to get their follow-up care, we actually go visit them. And so in that capacity, I've had a lot of seen a lot of high-risk patients, done a lot of assessments for suicide, sent people to the hospital for concerns about self-harm, and then done a lot of testifying in court for keeping people in the hospital over their objection or prescribing medications over their objection. We'll do some quick facts on suicide. In 2022, about 50,000 deaths by suicide and 1.2 million attempts in the United States. I put this on because the rate is about 14 per 100,000. That's in a whole year. And so if you're assessing this acute suicide risk, like let's say within a few weeks, it's even much less. So suicide is pretty rare, and that adds to some of the some of the complication of assessing for suicide and what kind of factors can and should be done for intervention. Males commit suicide at 4 times the rate of females. Females have more attempts. Half of suicides are completed with firearms, and that becomes relevant when making plans for safety. I put this slide in because I actually didn't know this myself. I actually thought this is suicide rates by age range. And I actually thought that the age of 15 to 24 had the highest suicide rate, but it actually has the lowest suicide rate. And the highest suicide rate is people 85 and above, and the second highest is 75 and above. And so those populations have a lot of chronic pain and chronic disease, chronic medical conditions, which then that's why those are considered risk factors for suicide. I wanted to know, there are a lot of terms and words that are used around suicide and suicidal ideation and thoughts of dying and self-harm that come up in these cases. So I wanted to define and distinguish these terms. So the first thing is suicidal ideation, which just means thoughts of dying. And there's passive suicidal ideation, which means thoughts of dying, of thinking like people wishing that they don't want to be here, or sometimes they say, I wish I would just go to bed and not wake up, or and there isn't any intent on acting on this. And this is very common in conditions like depression, or if people are going through a stressful condition, loss of a loved one, or certain personality disorders. And you know, this doesn't mean that someone's gonna harm themselves, or particularly mean that they're at a very high risk. But of course, if you hear passive thoughts of suicide, then the next question is to distinguish if there are any active suicide thoughts. So active suicidal ideation is thoughts of suicide with some kind of plan or behavior. Like they will think, you know, I would do it and I would use a gun, or I would use it and I would do it by overdose. And a behavior can be any kind of behavior that's implementing that plan, like starting to hoard pills or buying a gun or writing a suicide note. Then there are suicide attempts. So suicide attempts is any act where someone does something to themselves with the intent to die. And so if someone, you know, overdoses with the intent to die, or goes into oncoming traffic, but that is any kind of action taken with an intent to die, and that is distinguished from self-harm. So self-harm is any kind of self-harm behavior, but the goal is not to die. Many people cut themselves superficially on the wrist. They'll say they do that to feel something or to make an emotional pain physical, which some people find easier to handle than emotional pain. People might do something as a cry for help. Or people might self-harm or say that they're suicidal to gain shelter or admission to a hospital. Someone, you know, who's unhoused might want to be admitted to a hospital. Someone's in prison, wants to go to another unit, or, you know, get out and go to a hospital. In child psychiatry, when I did my rotation, you know, a lot of children live in kind of dysfunctional homes, and when they don't want to deal with it anymore, they would, you know, want to go and take a respite in the hospital. So all these things can be considered, there's some kind of secondary gain with either a suicide behavior or a suicide threat. I want to talk to us about some risk factors for suicide. There are many risk factors for suicide, and that's kind of what I want to get across with this slide and the next slide. The number one risk factor for suicide is past suicide attempts. Otherwise, there are many factors that fall, you know, somewhat into these categories. Really, there are only a few of them, and I highlighted in bold, which are like acute, which is very current, like a change in the mental illness, like it's the severity or symptoms. A lot of these things are chronic and kind of exist in someone, and that adds to the challenge of really seeing whether someone's acutely suicidal. This is a truncated list. This is like a full list. So anytime you Google or look up what are risk factors for suicide, all of these things come up. And I just put this on to show that one of the challenges in acute suicide assessment is there's no mathematical formula in which you're going to account for all of these factors and plug it in, and then it comes out, yes, they're suicidal, or no, they can, they're fine. And so that's a challenge that psychiatrists face, when doing assessments in the field. Now we'll go to common claims that for these are reasons that outpatient psychiatrists, might be sued, if someone does self-harm or suicide. Outpatient, by outpatient, I mean doctors who see patients in a clinic, like the patients aren't in a hospital or in a closed unit somewhere. So first is failure to identify suicide risk. If a doctor didn't ask about suicide or understand that there is a risk, didn't, take into account some of these factors and ask the patient, further about suicidal ideation or behaviors. Next is failure to implement a plan for a patient known to be at risk. So there is some elevated risk for a patient, and a plan can be sending them to a hospital or more frequent visits, or talking to loved ones, getting firearms out of the house, reaching out to family so that someone else dispenses their medication so they don't have access to a whole bunch of pills that they can overdose on. So those are all examples of a plan you might implement if someone seems to be like that they're at a higher risk. Failure to hospitalize, that could go right. That could be a subheading of failure to implement a plan, but this is probably the most common thing that an outpatient psychiatrist might be accused of regarding malpractice for someone who does hurt themselves or commit suicide. Inadequate treatment, this will be the realm of, starting the wrong medications or not following the medications properly. Next is we'll go to common claims against institutions. So institutions are like hospitals. The first one, same, failure to identify a suicide risk. Inadequate monitoring. So when a patient is admitted to an inpatient psychiatric hospital, they can be monitored many different ways. It's a locked unit, so they can't get out. But if someone's high risk, you could order that someone checks in on them every 4 to 6 hours. Someone could check in on them every 15 minutes. You can also assign a one-to-one monitor who literally is with the patient 24/7 if they're considered particularly high risk. I remember when I worked at Bellevue Hospital, we're getting admissions from violent criminals who are psychotic, and they would come to Bellevue. So almost everyone could be considered the highest risk, but there really isn't the staff to monitor everyone one-to-one. And so if there ever was an incident, there was always a lot of tension between assigning the risk and having the staff to do so. Failure to control environmental hazards. This is so in hospitals, when patients enter, they are searched for things, and things are removed that could be used to hurt them, like pens, pencils. Sometimes they take away shoelaces. And then in the environment, like windows patients don't have access to windows, or windows are barred. So if they don't control one of those things, and a patient's able to use something to hurt themselves, that could be a grounds for a lawsuit. Inadequate treatment, that's again having to do with the actual treatment using medications. And an inappropriate discharge. So when a hospital discharges someone, there should be a plan for continuity of care. So they should be discharged with enough medicines to get them through to the next appointment. The next appointment should be made generally within 7 days of discharge. I want to talk now about complications. These are things that are often the things that are often argued in court. So what's taught to psychiatrists as far as malpractice is that psychiatrists aren't expected to predict the future. But if they fail to see a suicide risk that is foreseeable and they don't act appropriately, that's where standard of care is breached. But that concept of foreseeability can be debated. So if you talk about, the rate of suicide is about 15 per 100,000. In any given 4-week period, it's 15 per 1.2 million, just 100,000 times 12. Um, Even saying that a psychiatric population is 100 times more likely to commit suicide, let's say, then that rate is still 1 in 1,000. And as we talked about with all those other factors, there is no real standard agreed upon way um, to make sense of all the different risk factors and come out with a formula. So it can be, the argument can be made that a lot of times it wasn't predictable. And we'll go into some case studies which talk about that more. As I said, there was no standard assessment tool or definitive risk factors. There are many different assessment tools out there, but there is no like one, everyone agrees that, yeah, this is the one. And we talked about this a little, but many of the risk factors that do exist are chronic or nonspecific or common. So when you're doing an acute assessment, it's hard to understand how to, because you can't define someone as always suicidal, because hospital visits or any kind of follow-up is more short-term. And then there's the issue of self-harm and secondary gain. So a lot of people might say that they're suicidal in order to get something in return. This happens pretty commonly, and I'd say most of suicide assessments or threats or gestures that happen in outpatient, most of them are from the second category and not true suicide attempts. But this starts to get challenging, because if a patient knows that, let's say they want to get into a hospital, they know that if they say, I'm just doing this to get into a hospital, that they won't be admitted. So then they do some kind of suicide, gesture, like take a few pills. But if it's not that lethal, then they know that it's not going to work. So that it starts to become to a dangerous game of chicken. And I think this is where a lot of challenges happen in psychiatry. Other complications. So many interventions, if you do decide to intervene, they're traumatic and short term. So, many times families will be concerned that someone has said something or done something that represents a suicide attempt, and the patient denies that it was a real suicide attempt. But they have risk factors too. So a doctor can force a patient to go to the hospital, but that's a pretty traumatic thing to happen. People have jobs now; they have to tell their job that they're not, that they can't come into work. This causes a lot of stress. You might violate a patient's privacy to get them in the hospital by like talking to other doctors or notifying family members. But that's also pretty traumatic. And like I said, many interactions involve privacy violations, stigma, and disruptions to life. I remember when I was in residency, I did it in Illinois, and Illinois had a rule that anyone who was admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit, they had to be shared they wouldn't be allowed to have a firearm. And so we had a lot of police officers that wouldn't want to get help when they needed it, because then they say, well, then I'll lose my job. And in our unit, in our hospital, the detox unit was also the same as the inpatient psychiatric unit. And so, people with substance use issues and psychiatric issues were incentivized to not be honest about them. And this is the issue that happens with interventions. I think the department chair used some creative accounting to like admit them to neurology units or internal medicine units, giving them some other diagnosis, but really they were there for psychiatric care. And this is kind of what happens in the weeds. You have a well-meaning rule, like, people in psychiatric hospitals shouldn't have firearms, but then a lot of times any kind of stigma would kind of discourage people from admitting that they need help. Interventions will teach patients to mistrust mental health professionals. So if a patient is honest about, they're having thoughts about self-harm, but they insist they won't do it, or they don't want to go to a hospital. If you hospitalize them, you've kind of taught them to mistrust being honest with mental health professionals. And for a short-term gain of like 2 weeks in a hospital, let's say, but for that 2 weeks in the hospital, you may have taught them to be dishonest or not see a psychiatrist at all for the rest of their lives. And so there's a real tension with how far you want to go with this. Though you have the power to hospitalize, what good is it, and how much do you wind up hurting things in the long run? Finally, this is the last thing. So in a lot of how psychiatrists are taught is that, plaintiffs lawyers will say that extensive documentation for suicide risk factors is a way to protect yourself. So even if, let's say, you decide not to hospitalize, but you document your entire thought process, how you came to that conclusion, even if you're wrong, it can be very protective. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's certainly good advice. Sometimes where it comes into conflict here is that if you're seeing a patient, let's say, who has an elevated suicide risk, and you have a given amount of time to see that patient, you want more of that time to be face-to-face. Even now, I mean, the most common complaint of patients with doctors is doctors don't spend enough face-to-face time, and they're spending a lot of time doing paperwork. And here's a situation where someone's higher risk, so you want to even give them more face-to-face time. But then if you're also, if the advice is also to spend more time documenting, at some point the time is a finite factor, and you want to do good for the patient. You actually want to spend more time, talking to them face to face and coming up with a plan and documenting that you did that, but you didn't have time to write paragraphs. And then since most people won't wind up killing themselves, this advice really turns into just documenting extensively for all patients for whom there's a suicide risk. But then that takes away time from other patients they have to see that day. So that's where the tensions can arise in psychiatric treatment. So what I look for in medical records is that, was a patient assessed for suicidal ideation or behavior when appropriate? So when appropriate means, if a mood disorder is getting worse, or it's the first time you're meeting a patient. In general, doctors don't ask about suicide for every patient for every interaction. If you've been seeing a patient for 1 year for mild anxiety and the patient's saying, their anxiety is fine, you're not going to ask about suicidal ideation in those scenarios. So was the patient assessed for suicide when appropriate? And then if yes, was it followed up in some reasonable way? So if it's passive, did they ask about active? If it's active, did they come up with some kind of plan? And was it a reasonable plan at the time? We'll go into one case study. This is something that I was consulted on: a prison inmate with a history of self-harm and threatening suicide for secondary gains, threatened suicide and demanded transfer to another unit of the prison or a hospital, either one he wanted. The transfer was denied. He wound up drinking bleach and then sued the prison for damages caused by the resulting harm from drinking bleach. I didn't get more details as this didn't move forward, but I think this is a great example of something that would typically happen in a prison. And I think it highlights a central tension. So a plaintiff's attorney might say, look, you're saying this was for secondary gain. First of all, you can't know that. The guy said that I'm suicidal. And so you're basing it based on past behavior, but you don't know that. And even if it was for secondary gain, the patient actually hurt himself very badly. And some patients, they might actually die. I mean, if he drank bleach, he could have died. So regardless of what the intent was, they were dangerous to themselves, and they couldn't even calculate a reasonable risk. They went way overboard. And so whoever didn't hospitalize, recognizing that this person is dangerous to themselves, is liable. And that's a good argument. And a defense attorney might say, look, if someone says they're going to drink bleach, unless you do this. So do this or I will kill myself. And if you say then deny it, and then that physician becomes liable for any kind of behavior afterwards, then what you're saying is anyone can threaten suicide for any reason and then get what they want, because then if they then they become then the doctor becomes personally liable, and even for suicide or even any kind of damages if they didn't commit suicide. And that's kind of untenable. I mean, all inpatient psychiatric units would just be, used as de facto shelters. And it would drown out, beds that are needed for people who are legitimately psychotic or legitimately mentally ill. So I think this is a good example of the tensions that happen in the real world. Another case study. This is a real case uh, of a patient who saw he saw his primary care doctor on May 30th, 2012, for lower back pain. He complained of anxiety related to his new supervisor. So the doctor prescribed a medicine called Xanax. Xanax is a medicine that you take as needed that can help with anxiety. But 5 days later, his anxiety worsened, and the patient called the doctor saying that he couldn't sleep. And he wanted to see the doctor that day, but that day the doctor wasn't available, but he did prescribe a sleeping medicine. Then 2 days after that, the patient's wife brought the patient in to see the doctor emergently. And the wife made the appointment, and she said she told the patient, this is what she testified, either you see the doctor or I'm taking you to a hospital. And the wife said that, the patient anxiety had worsened. He was saying things like, I can't take this and I can't live like this. He was making some passive suicidal threats. The wife testified that, there was a significant change in the patient's mood, anxiety, depression, weight loss, and that the wife was concerned that the patient would kill himself. But when the doctor asked the patient about suicide, the patient denied any suicidal ideation or plan. And so the doctor prescribed an antidepressant, explained that it would take some while for it to work, but that he had the Xanax, which is the immediate acting medicine, in the meantime. But the next morning, the patient killed himself, and the wife found him in the garage. And so the wife brought a lawsuit against Dr. Strange, the doctor, for failing to send him to a psychiatric ER or having him to see a psychiatrist. And they won, and the plaintiff was awarded $10 million judgment in 2018. But plot twist, in 2019, a judge reversed the decision. And one reason he cited was that it was unclear when the patient had decided to kill himself. So it could have been that the patient was not suicidal at the time that he met the doctor in the office, and then he changed his mind later, in which case it was not foreseeable. In addition, the doctor had the doctor sent him to the ER, he might not have been admitted because he was denying suicidal ideation. And it is kind of hard in an emergency room to admit someone against their will when they say that they're not suicidal. You can do it, and if you can say that a family member is concerned, but also I think people, the law is such that you can't have someone else, on the word of someone else, saying that you might do something when you say you won't, having a loss of freedom like that. And this comes to causality. So there's a dereliction of duty that directly leads to damages. The causality here is that even if he made a mistake, had he sent him to the ER, that doesn't necessarily, he might not have been admitted. It doesn't necessarily prevent the damages. Also, in the lawsuit, said that the doctor was sued because he didn't refer them to ER or have him see a psychiatrist. But had he referred him to a psychiatrist, he wouldn't have seen the psychiatrist that day, and he committed suicide that night. So even had he referred him to a psychiatrist, the damage still would have happened. So again, there's the immediate causality was an issue. So those are two case studies, I think, that highlight some of the difficulties with assessing for suicide. And that's all I had for my talk, and I'm ready to answer any questions people might have.
Great, thank you so much. I will say it just shows how complicated these issues are and gives me, a lot of empathy towards what you do every day. So thank you. Um, can you talk about medicines that are used to treat depression that have a warning on their label that they can cause suicide, like Prozac?
Yes. So the most commonly used class of medicines to treat depression are called SSRIs. Prozac is one of them. And in 2004, they got a black box warning by the FDA, which a black box saying that they increase suicidal thoughts and behavior in people under 24 and under. Uh, and a black box warning is just the highest degree of warning for certain medications for side effects that the FDA wants to highlight. Um, they found out because it was based on they pooled like I think something around 300 studies of 100,000 people and found that suicidal thinking or behavior increased from 2% to 4%. So it's 4% on these medicines and 2% on placebo. No increase in suicide attempts, but they called it suicidal thinking or behavior. One of the controversies was they pulled like 300 studies, so there was no consistent definition of what they would call suicide behavior, suicide thinking. But the FDA decided that that was significant to put a warning on it. And so that's why there's a warning. In further analysis, it didn't seem like there's any statistically significant increase from age 18 or above, but 18 or below, there was an increase in the suicidal thinking or behavior. And thinking might refer to, passive thoughts of death. And I'm not sure what they mean by behavior, but they didn't mean suicide attempts. And again, the complication here is there wasn't a clear definition of those two things because it wasn't only one study.
So I guess to follow up on that, if somebody is prescribed an SSRI and somebody dies, by suicide, is that something that somebody needs to be concerned about?
Well, if prescribing an SSRI, I think it's expected that whenever a doctor prescribes medicine, they're expected to have a conversation with patients about risks and benefits from that medicine. So with SSRIs, certainly black box warnings and would come into that risks discussion.
Okay, great. We have some additional questions.
Oh, super. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, awesome. Hi, doctor. Thank you so much for your time. This was very, very helpful. So my question is, I'm dealing with a patient that was involuntarily committed for a suicide attempt and was still expressing ideations and had reservations about his ability to be discharged from the program. His time under commitment was coming up, and his treating psychiatrist at this institution drafted up an extension application, but never filed it because there was an indication from the patient's insurance company that they would no longer cover inpatient treatment. So he was what I believe to be was prematurely discharged. Could you speak a little bit about that, about the obligation of involuntary commitments, which I imagine are going to be astronomically expensive when there's a lack of insurance coverage and so forth?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this happens all the time. And this is the this is the tension of keeping someone inpatient who and the very act of keeping someone inpatient makes their lives worse. So in this scenario, the patient then becomes liable in theory for the charges of his hospitalization when the insurance doesn't cover it. And so, this goes into what the collection situation like is of the hospital, but then the patient now who is already, experiencing some difficulty, which is why he'd be in the hospital in the first place, is now being put in debt because the doctor was holding him against his will, and it's a very difficult situation. But I mean, I think the answer to your question is if the doctor feels like the patient is at imminent risk of suicide such that he needs continued hospitalization, then the doctor is expected to keep him. Or and then the question has to be asked is how is continuing to keep the patient in the hospital alleviating that risk of suicide? So that's where the chronic risk factors, they're not going to eliminate the chronic risk factors. So, people should not be hospitalized for those. The acute thing is like, okay, if you've started on a medication, and sometimes antidepressants take, 2 to 4 weeks to work, or antipsychotic medications, whatever it is, and you're waiting on it to work so that the patient's mood improves and they don't seem suicidal. That's a perfectly acceptable reason to keep someone in the hospital. Or if you can come up with some kind of plan, a lot of times you can say that someone's mental health would improve if they're with their families versus if they're in the hospital. So without knowing the specifics, it's very difficult. And
Dr. Buch, how do you balance when the patient themselves say they don't feel safe going home, which it sounds like is the issue with this particular case?
Yeah, I mean, it's more clear when the patient is agreeing that they're not clear to go home. Then the question is, why would the insurance company deny the visit? Were they suspecting some kind of secondary gain? So was this basically to a shelter issue? And then those come into play as well.
But you can't make a care decision based entirely on insurance, whether it's covered or not. I will say that, like, as a physician, I try, it's very hard to do this, but I try to think about what I would do if insurance were no object first, and then think about how insurance colors it, and then balance those two, and then that helps me get to the right choice for that patient. So that's kind of how I try to do it as a treating clinician. I don't know if that is the same thing in the world of psychiatry, Dr. Buch.
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, you have what you would do if insurance wasn't an object, and then how insurance colors it. But it might color it significantly. If a patient is now liable for $3,000 a day and they feel it's not, I don't know, what would happen in the future. I think, I don't know how collections it works, but if the patient feels like this is now making me feel much worse, and so every day you're seeing them in the hospital, they're more upset, and not being in the hospital might make them less upset. It's something to, keep in mind. In this case, the person, I think the patient himself is saying, I don't feel like leaving. And I think that's much easier than is that you're kind of wanted to do right by the patient.
Any other follow-up questions, Attorney Russo?
I'd love to ask another. I don't want to monopolize time.
It doesn't look like there's any other questions that people have put in the Q&A. So this is a call for questions in the Q&A, but go ahead, Attorney Russo.
Thanks. I lucked out. You could charge me. I'm just kidding. Okay. The other fact pattern, a separate case. A patient was admitted in a state-sponsored psychiatric facility he was schizophrenic and having severe issues. He had like 5 prior admissions. He was a severe mental health case patient. And he developed low sodium due to the medication that he was on. So he had to be transferred to a private facility emergency room for blood work to be performed. And he was given what appears to be a poorly trained escort. and experienced anxiety in the emergency room, asked to get some fresh air, and elopes and dies from a delirium-induced heart attack while escaping a whole host of people trying to chase after him. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on that, if there is a need for care at an outside private facility, and what are the duties and responsibilities of the medical providers in the initial psychiatric facility who have an obligation, I would imagine, to maintain custodial care. But what happens if they have to, if the care has to go outside of the abilities of the original institution to provide that care? If you could speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I mean, psychiatric institutions are expected to maintain the environment. They can be sued for not having the proper environment, which is like, boarding up windows and searching for things that can hurt themselves, keeping the doors locked. And so if the faulty lock and someone escaped from it, the institution could be liable. But here's this case where he had to go to somewhere that wasn't designed to see psychiatric patients. And he had to go there because there was an acute medical issue. So there's two competing needs. There's the if you're going to do a triage,
And the medical issue was arguably secondary to the psychiatric treatment, by the way.
Sounds like it, yeah.
The hyponatremia.
Well, it was odd if they transferred him just to do blood work. That was the weird part of the story. But
I bet my guess is that they got blood work. They saw his sodium was low and they transferred him for workup.
Correct.
No?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So he's in an ER for workup of this as a inpatient.
And what takes, if you're triaging, what takes precedent, the florid psychotic illness or low sodium? I mean, low sodium can be problematic too.
No, it can kill you. Yeah. As an internist. So yeah.
Right. So yeah, and so
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, this is like a good question, because the one-to-one person that they assign is not some like burly security person. A lot of times it's a nurse or like a nurse's aide or something. So
oftentimes they're very low skilled people who have very little training, who just sit there and are on their phone. Sandip and I were talking about this before. I mean, sometimes they're reading a book. They're not even paying attention to what this is not appropriate. But, you just because there's somebody there, it doesn't mean that the threshold is not very high in terms of training for that person. They're just there to make sure that the person, doesn't access anything to hurt themselves, basically.
Yeah, I mean, if I were reviewing this case, it would be like, was there a compelling reason to transfer the person? So was the medical condition sufficiently concerning? And low sodium can be concerning, and so he had to go to an institution that wasn't designed to prevent people from eloping. Maybe someone should have made sure that there was someone watching him who could overcome him physically. But if that person wasn't really available, should they have not transferred them in the first place until that person was available? And doesn't that put the person's life at risk too? So I think you have to choose between them, and was it unreasonable for them to transfer? And so those what I'd be looking for in the details of the case. And sometimes if you have to choose between two bad options and you choose the least bad option, I think that's defensible. But if there was some easy thing to do that could have made it not a bad option, like if there was some burly type security guard, and then that could have been done. But it's unclear what options there were.
Yeah, thank you.
Amy, I think you're.
Do we have any other questions? before we move on? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Those
So
questions were great. Those questions were really like, yeah, really like what
yeah, they
happens in
make you
the world.
think. Well, that's why this is so much fun. So, thank you so much, Dr. Buch. You can see, how great he is at High Rock Experts. We have access to over 4,000 doctors like him to help with your cases, and you know how crucial it is to find the right expert for your case. So please reach out to us if you need help finding an expert. Thank you everyone for attending. Be sure to check out our next webinar in the series, which is next month with obstetrician Dr. Alizadeh, who will be discussing birth injuries for attorneys. So I know that you guys will enjoy that one. Learn more and sign up at our LinkedIn page. And thank you again. And I appreciate everybody. Thank you.